Hello. This video looks at Chapter 2, Consequentialist Theories of Morality. In this video, we're going to be looking at pages 30 through 45 from the reading for this week. This is from the book Ethics, Theory and Practice by Jacques Thoreau and Keith Grossman. This reading's available on our course Canvas page. I'm not sure what happened to Keith's name there, but it disappeared for some reason. Interesting. Okay. An overview of what we're about to cover. So, consequentialist theories of morality are concerned with the consequences of our actions. So that seems like a fairly straightforward naming convention, of course. But these theories look at what results from our actions and uses that to decide whether or not the action is right or wrong. So the two views we're going to consider today are ethical egoism and utilitarianism. So we're going to consider the pros and cons of both of these views. We're going to begin with ethical egoism. So there are three types of ethical egoism. There's individual ethical egoism, and this is the view that everyone ought to act in my own best self-interest. So what this is saying is that every person that exists should act in the way that would be best for me, and you, of course, would personalize this to you. There's personal ethical egoism, which is the view that I ought to act in my own self-interest, but it makes no claims about what anyone else should do. And then there's universal ethical egoism. And this is, as a basic principle, the idea that everyone should always act in his or her own best interest, regardless of the interests of others, unless these other interests also serve his or hers. So, universal ethical egoism is the idea of egoism, but universalized to all people. Now, a problem with the first two, individual ethical egoism and personal ethical egoism, is that they don't work as moral theories very well because they can't be made to apply generally to all people. So notice that that's because they're really narrowly focused on what is in each individual person's best interest and not at all considering the interest of other people. And so, because of this, it's difficult to turn them into the kind of theory that we're looking for. So, we're going to consider universal ethical egoism. So, there's a number of problems with ethical egoism. The first is to understand what is meant when we say everyone. So, ethical egoism claims that everyone should act in their own self-interest. But what do we do when two people's self-interest conflicts? It seems that ethical egoism doesn't give us any way to resolve this type of conflict. And we're going to see this come up again in here in a second. Another problem with ethical egoism is that it's really difficult to give moral advice when you're an ethical egoist. So imagine a universal ethical egoist, John, advising another person named Tom. If John advises Tom in John's own best interest, then he's really an individual egoist, right? Because notice what John is doing is telling Tom what's best for him, disregarding what's best for John. So he's not a universal egoist at all. But notice that if John advises Tom in Tom's best interest, then John's not serving his own best interest. And so he isn't even doing what's in his own best interest. And this seems to create a conflict. Another problem with ethical egoism is that it seems to be inconsistent with what we might call the helping professions. So it's hard to show how an ethical egoist would be, it's hard to show how the view ethical egoism would be consistent with professions like being a doctor or a nurse or a social worker or a teacher, because these are professions where highly self-interested attitudes wouldn't serve you very well in your work. Another problem with ethical egoism is the blurring of ought and should. So, as I was mentioning earlier, when the ethical egoist is met with a conflict between two people's differing self-interests, the egoist ends up in a place where they have to tell a person what they should do, but then hope that the person doesn't actually do that. And that's kind of a strange place to be. There are, however, a few advantages to ethical egoism, as there are with most philosophical positions. One advantage is that it's easier to determine our own self-interests for the egoist. Now, we'll sort of see what this means when we get to utilitarianism, which is interested in considering all people's best interest. But it's easy for us to know what our own self-interest is, while it can be really difficult to know what's in someone else's best interest. Another advantage of ethical egoism is that it encourages individual freedom and responsibility. Now, if you buy this, which I don't, one thing that ethical egoism, one of the bonuses is that there is no need to be dependent on anyone else. You only need to seek your own self-interest and let others do the same. So, as we'll notice here in the next slide, the limitations to these types of advantages. One is that ethical egoism only really works well when people are operating in relative isolation. This is because as soon as two people interact and their self-interests are different, ethical egoism starts to run into problems. These problems come about because, as I mentioned earlier, there's no mechanism for compromise in ethical egoism. So any conflict with someone else's self-interest has to end in a compromise. And it's unclear how you're supposed to, what mechanism you're supposed to use to develop this compromise. And at this point, an ethical egoist either has to become a utilitarian, which, as we'll see, means that instead of considering only their own best interest, they need to concern themselves with the best interests of everyone that's involved in a situation, or they need to end up in this weird spot where they tell a person what they think the person should do, but then hope that the person doesn't do it. So, a quick summary of ethical egoism. Although the idea of always doing what's in our own self-interest may initially seem like a good way to determine what we should do, it turns out that ethical egoism has a number of significant challenges. How might someone who's interested in defending ethical egoism respond to the challenges that were raised against it? That's a question that you can ask as we move forward. Now I'm going to move on to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the view that everyone should perform the act or follow the rule that brings about the greatest good or most happiness for everyone concerned with that act. Now, the two people who are responsible primarily for bringing us utilitarianism initially are Jeremy Bentham. Bentham lived from 1748 to 1832, and John Stuart Mill. Mill lived from 1806 to 1873. And in what follows, I'll cover the two types of utilitarianism. There's act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Now I'm going to talk about act utilitarianism. So, under act utilitarianism, a person should perform the act that will bring about the greatest amount of good or least amount of bad for everyone that's affected by that act. So this form of utilitarianism asks, What's the best thing to do in this particular situation to bring about the most good? It's not concerned with establishing general rules for action. It asks for each act, what is the best thing I can do in this situation that'll bring about the most good? Now, a few criticisms of act utilitarianism. One is that there can be some difficulty determining the consequences of your actions for others. So if we remember back to egoism, one of the benefits of egoism was that it's easy to know your own consequences. So when we turn to utilitarianism, we see one of the criticisms of it is that it's difficult to determine the consequences of your actions for others. So it's hard to know when an act is going to have a good consequence for someone else. Or it may just seem like it's going to have a good consequence for someone else, but that's only because you don't know enough about the person and your action actually has a bad consequence for them. Another criticism of act utilitarianism is that it requires you to begin anew with each decision. And this is kind of impractical. It's asking each time you encounter something, what is the best thing that I can do that's going to cause the most positive outcomes in this situation? Another criticism of act utilitarianism is that it's difficult to understand how you would educate someone to follow this system. Because it's difficult to teach someone how to do something when there aren't any rules you can provide them with. Because remember, what act utilitarianism is saying is in each particular situation, choose the thing that brings about the most positive outcomes. And how could you ever know what that is if there aren't rules explaining what types of behaviors bring about more positive outcomes than others? The other form of utilitarianism we're going to look at is rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism changes the basic utilitarian principle that was originally everyone should always act to bring about the greatest good for all concerned, to instead be everyone should always establish and follow that rule for those rules that will bring about the greatest good for all concerned. So we can see it's a shift away from act towards rule. So, for example, rather than trying to decide in each situation if you should kill a person that's threatening you, a rule utilitarian might form the rule, never kill except in self-defense. So, what this does is it gives them situations when they should act in certain ways. And the way that they devise this rule is based on what historically has brought around the most positive outcomes. Now, of course, there's also some criticisms of rule utilitarianism. One, again, is the difficulty determining the consequences for others. Just like with act utilitarianism, it's hard to know for sure how an act's going to affect someone else. And in fact, this problem's multiplied for the rule utilitarian because it applies to all of the situations that a particular rule covers, not just each individual situation. And in addition, another problem is that rule utilitarianism seems to collapse into act utilitarianism in certain circumstances. So while rules are good for many situations, you can always find situations where rules don't apply. And in these situations, we start to discover that rule utilitarianism functions in the same way as act utilitarianism. Now, an example of what I'm talking about here, I think, can be found in the life of a college instructor. So, most instructors have various types of late policies, let's say, for work, accepted from students. And maybe they want to hold a rule that says, in this situation, I do this, right? But you don't have to be an instructor for very long before you realize that these rules are actually very weak, because whatever your rule is, there's always going to be a student who has some sort of life situation that your rule doesn't apply to, right? So notice that in this case, you just end up having to decide what to do in the particular circumstance that you're in. And so in this way, it seems like rule utilitarianism can ultimately collapse into act utilitarianism. Another couple some general criticisms of both rule and act utilitarianism. It becomes difficult to know how to assess the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So, for example, would it be justified to perform a painful and ultimately fatal experiment on 100 children if we could guarantee that it would save 10 million children in the future? How about 50 children if we don't think that 100 children, or 10, or 1? So the problem becomes that everything sort of turns into a cost-benefit analysis. And it becomes really unclear how we can draw that line in a principled way. So, for example, if you think, oh yeah, it would be perfectly okay to do painful and possibly fatal experiments on 100 children if we could guarantee that it would save 10 million, well then what about 1,000 children? What about 10,000? What is the point where you make the decision to draw the line? What if they were your children or children that you know, and so on? So I take it that you get the point. A quick review of what we've talked about so far. So I began by explaining that consequentialist theories of morality are concerned with consequences of our actions. And then we looked at ethical egoism, including arguments in favor of it and some problems that it faces. And then we looked at utilitarianism, and again considered some of its positive characteristics, along with some criticisms of it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that this video was helpful.